Emily was a young runner, passionate about adventures in nature. She lived for winding trails, lush forests, and the sense of freedom she found running in nature. That fall night, when the air was crisp and the full moon illuminated the scene, Emily decided to go for a solo run on a remote trail she hadn't yet explored. As she ventured down the winding trail, the smell of vegetation and the gentle sound of the night breeze enveloped her. The crunch of leaves beneath her feet was the only soundtrack she needed. Emily was in her element, feeling more alive than ever. However, his feeling of peace and tranquility was quickly replaced by an uncomfortable and unsettling feeling. Emily began to feel eyes fixed on her, as if she were being watched by something or someone. Her steps faltered, and she looked around in the darkness, but nothing seemed out of place. Emily decided it was just her imagination playing with her. She continued to run, although the feeling of being watched didn't leave her completely. As she progressed down the trail, the stares seemed to intensify. It was as if something was following her, keeping hidden in the shadows of the trees. Emily could feel the uneasiness growing inside her, but she didn't want to let the fear take over. Then the whispers started. They were soft, unintelligible murmurs, as if the wind were whispering secrets around them. Emily stopped again, this time her eyes wide with apprehension. She looked around in the darkness, but saw no one. The forest was quiet, except for the sounds of his own breathing. Determined not to let fear take over, Emily decided to continue her run. She thought maybe the whispers were just the sound of the wind passing through the leaves of the trees. But as she progressed, the whispers persisted, growing in intensity and proximity. It was as if the whispering voices were getting closer to her, becoming more and more audible. Emily began to feel surrounded, cornered by some invisible, threatening presence. His heart beat wildly, and cold ran down his spine. Finally, Emily could no longer ignore her fear. She knew something was wrong, and her intuition warned her of an imminent threat. Taking a deep breath, she decided to slow down and stay alert. She didn't know what was going on, but she was determined to find out and, if necessary, face it head-on. As Emily continued her run, whispers continued to haunt her footsteps. They were now more audible and unmistakable, as if an ominous presence was approaching her. The whispers were gradually replaced by laughter, but not ordinary laughter. They were macabre, chilling laughter that echoed through the forest in a disturbing way. Emily felt a wave of panic rise within her, but she still couldn't see who or what was chasing her. She looked back as she ran, catching a glimpse of a dark, hooded figure among the trees. The figure seemed to be floating in the air, as if it had no weight. The details were indistinct, but his eyes were fixed on Emily with terrifying intensity. The young runner increased her pace, fear driving her to run faster. Her heart was beating like a drum in her chest, and she could feel the sweat running down her face. However, no matter how hard she ran, the hooded figure seemed to keep up with her, never moving away. The forest seemed to be closing in around Emily, the trees seeming taller and more threatening as she went. She was trapped in a living nightmare, running for her life, not knowing what was happening or who was after her. The hooded figure's ghoulish laughter echoed in his ears, filling the night with a sense of horror. Emily knew she needed to find a way out or help, but the forest seemed endless, with no end in sight. That's when she saw a small clearing in front of her. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to escape the terrifying persecution. Emily ran toward the clearing, desperate to find refuge and help. But the hooded figure was not willing to give up so easily. With grim determination, she followed Emily into the clearing. The young runner arrived there, panting and with her heart beating wildly, frantically looking for a way out. She hid behind one of the fallen trees in the clearing, praying that her pursuer would pass by without seeing her. Emily held her breath and closed her eyes, listening carefully to the approaching footsteps. The hooded figure entered the clearing, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. Emily could hear the heavy breathing and sadistic laughter approaching. She silently prayed for the figure to leave her alone. It was then that something surprising happened. The hooded figure stopped abruptly and looked confused, as if he was losing track. She looked around the clearing, but couldn't find Emily hiding behind the fallen tree. Emily watched in silence as her pursuer finally turned and walked away from the clearing. She couldn't believe how lucky she had been. He had given up the chase. After a few minutes of making sure her pursuer was far enough away, Emily emerged from her hiding spot and began heading towards the trail once again. She was determined to get out of that forest and find help to understand what had happened. She knew that she was alive through pure luck, and the terrifying chase was still fresh in her mind, leaving her with a sense of indescribable horror. Emily continued her run down the trail, her heart now filled with relief at having temporarily escaped her pursuer. She was exhausted, but fear and adrenaline drove her to continue. The forest seemed like a dark maze, and she was determined to find a way out. With every step she took, Emily frantically searched for signs of civilization or help. She had no idea who the hooded stalker was or why he was chasing her, but she knew she needed to find refuge and tell someone her story. Minutes turned into hours, and the young runner finally emerged into a larger clearing. She saw the lights of a distant road and felt a mixture of hope and despair. Emily was determined to reach that road and find someone who could help her. However, his pursuer seemed not to have given up completely. She could feel him nearby, watching her from the shadows. The macabre laughter still echoed in her mind, reminding her that the threat had not completely disappeared. With renewed determination, Emily picked up her pace and ran toward the road. She could hear the footsteps behind her, getting closer and closer. His chase was far from over. As Emily approached the road, she saw the headlights of a car approaching. She ran towards the vehicle, waving frantically to get the driver's attention. Her body was exhausted, but she couldn't give up now. The car stopped abruptly, and the driver got out to help Emily, who was visibly scared and exhausted. She told her story to the driver, who immediately called the police to report the terrifying chase she had suffered. As they waited for the police to arrive, Emily realized that her stalker had not yet been caught. She didn't know who he was or why he was chasing her, but fear and uncertainty haunted her. She was grateful to have escaped with her life, but she knew the chase wasn't over yet. When the police arrived, Emily gave her statement describing the hooded stalker and the macabre laughter that had tormented her. However, authorities had no concrete clues about the stalker's identity, leaving Emily feeling vulnerable. She returned home that night, her heart full of gratitude for having survived the terrifying persecution, but also with the knowledge that her life would never be the same. The shadow of that dark night would remain with her. Emily decided not to run alone on the forest trails again. She knew she needed to be more cautious and vigilant than ever. As she lay in bed that night, the memory of the macabre laughter echoing in the forest haunted her, leaving her with a feeling of insecurity and a deep, unsolved mystery about the hooded stalker. She knew the chase was over at that moment, but the nightmare would remain in her mind for a long time. The days following the horrific incident on the trail were filled with anxiety and fear for Emily. She felt constantly watched, even when she was at home. Each unusual sound made her jump and look around, fearing that her hooded pursuer might appear at any moment. Nighttime became the hardest part, with frequent nightmares haunting her. The police continued to investigate the case, but until that moment, there were no concrete clues as to the identity of the stalker. Emily was frustrated and terrified by uncertainty. She longed for answers and justice. Determined to regain control of her life, Emily decided to look into additional safety measures. She hired a security system for her home and began training in self-defense. She also went to therapy to help her deal with the trauma she had faced. Months passed, and Emily's life gradually returned to normal, although the shadow of the past continued to haunt her. She resumed her passion for running, but never ventured alone on the forest trails again. Then one day, as Emily was leaving the house for a morning run in a local park, she found a letter left on her door. Her heart sank when she picked it up and recognized the unfamiliar handwriting. She opened the letter carefully and read the ominous words written on it. "I have never forgotten you, Emily. The chase is far from over. I have been waiting, watching. You cannot hide forever." The terror he had felt that night on the trail returned with a vengeance. Her hooded stalker was back, and he knew where she lived. The nightmare was far from over. Emily immediately called the police and turned in the letter as evidence. Authorities began a new round of investigations, but Emily's feeling of helplessness increased. His pursuer was cunning and elusive, always one step ahead. Days turned into weeks, and Emily lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety. She felt like she was always looking over her shoulder, hoping that her pursuer might appear at any moment. It was then that the police made a crucial discovery. They traced the origin of the letter to an abandoned mailbox in a remote area of the forest. The box contained clues that led authorities to a man named Daniel, who had a history of obsessive behavior and was linked to previous stalking cases. Based on the evidence collected, police obtained an arrest warrant for Daniel. However, when they went to arrest him at his home, he was missing. He seemed to have anticipated the police action and fled. The chase wasn't over, but Emily at least had a name to associate with her pursuer. She knew she needed to be more vigilant than ever and continue to take safety measures. The months that followed were tense, with Emily constantly alert for any sign of Daniel. She moved to a new location and sought support from friends and family. She wasn't about to let her stalker control her life forever. Time passed, and finally the police managed to locate Daniel and arrest him. He was convicted of stalking, among other crimes, and sentenced to a long prison sentence. With her stalker arrested, Emily was finally able to begin to heal. The nightmare he had lived for so long was coming to an end. She still looked over her shoulder from time to time, but she finally began to find peace and security. She returned to running on the forest trails, although she never forgot the terrifying night that changed her forever. Emily had survived the relentless persecution, and now she was determined to live her life without fear.